Thank you for coming out in the heat. We've got an hour and a quarter, right?
Right.
So I thought I'd talk for around half that time, about 40 minutes or so, about a book that I'm working on. You can always interrupt at any time to say, I didn't get that, or I disagree, or would you say it again? But also at the end, I'll leave explicit time for discussion, because you may very well have questions about this project. My name is Wendy Doniger, and I've been writing books about Hinduism since my doctoral dissertation in 1968. So that's what, 40 years, 78, 88, 90, yes. And I published my first book in 73, and I've been writing books about Hinduism, one every couple of years, for a long time, and I never had any trouble until around 2002. And in 2002, I was giving a lecture in London, a big lecture in a series about Hinduism, and somebody threw an egg at me. And the egg sailed past me and landed on the wall behind me, and the interlocutor, the host, who was Will Dalrymple, a very famous historian of India. And we all said, and went on. And then afterward, there were emails. This was just the beginning of a series of blogs where someone who had been in the audience objected to the fact that in my talk I had mentioned parts of a Hindu text that we have never heard of, he said. Moreover, it was a passage in which the wife of the god Rama, Sita, the wife of the god Rama, accuses Rama's brother of perhaps having designs on her himself and therefore not assisting his brother as he should have done, which is a famous passage in a text in Sanskrit from around 200 BCE. So this was the passage he objected to, and he objected to the fact that I had mentioned a part of the Hindu tradition that he was unaware of. And this turned out to be the tip of a very ugly iceberg. The Hindu equivalent of our people who blow up abortion clinics, and people in Islam who blow up towers in New York, and people in Israel and in Palestine who blow up one another. The whole fundamentalist wave that has gone over the religions of the world at this time. And the Hindu variety of it is relatively mild, and it's also relatively small. It consists of a number of people, mostly engineers and people in the communications industry, people who are familiar with computers in America and also in India, who are the heirs to the 19th century British influence on Hinduism. Reform movements that came up in India in the 19th century as a result of Protestant missionary activity in India, which filtered down into Hinduism itself and produced a kind of self-loathing, a rejection of certain aspects of their own religion, which the British scorned. The less philosophical and the more earthy parts of Hinduism, the gods with many arms, the temples covered with beautiful girls with breasts like mangoes. That whole aspect of Hinduism, which is really in some ways, certainly numerically, by far the dominant strain, was pushed aside in favor of another aspect, which is also ancient in India, which is the philosophical and ascetic tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, which Emerson had admired, and the Upanishads, which Schelling had admired, and so forth. Those bits of the philosophical tradition of India, which the Europeans had liked, the Hindus themselves, that is to say, Hindus who knew about Europe, which is a small percentage, the upper classes, the people who knew English, and so forth. So that 19th century strain has stayed there and has now surfaced in the internet in a small group of Hindus who would rewrite the history of Hinduism and deny the existence of some of the most important aspects, and for my money, the most useful and wise and brilliant aspects of Hinduism that there are. So I have taken it upon myself to write a book about the history of the Hindus, highlighting precisely those parts of the aspects of the history of Hinduism that this vociferous internet group of people, the people that are most likely, for instance, to write the articles on Wikipedia, that crowd in America and in India, indeed, have put out there and trying to put out an alternative story. So I begin by, and this is a book that Penguin is going to publish as a trade book, so if it can get out there, it'll get out there. There's a question as to whether it should be published in India, and whether I should also go to India after publishing this book, which are questions that I am seriously debating with my publisher and indeed with my lawyer, because these people can be very nasty. So how then does one go on about telling the story of the Hindus by including the maverick as well as the mainstream Hindus in the story? The assumption of this other kind of Hinduism that I'm speaking not against but in counterpart to assumes that all of Hinduism is controlled by dead white males, by Brahmins, by male upper-class Hindus who control the text written in Sanskrit, which is the literary language of ancient India, the language from which North Indian languages like Hindi and Bengali and so forth are derived, but which is only spoken by priests, rather the way that Latin was spoken by priests until, well, David Tracy spoke Latin when he was trained in Rome in the 50s. So there are people who can speak Sanskrit, but anyone who ever spoke Sanskrit also spoke another language. No one ever said, pass the butter in Sanskrit. You always had another language in which you spoke to your wife, because women in the early stages didn't speak Sanskrit. Most of them weren't educated in it. You spoke to your servants and so forth. So there was a constant conversation between these privileged upper caste men who controlled the Sanskrit text, which is the literary record of India, and the more vibrant people of India, the women, the lower castes, the people who had all sorts of folk tales and stories and so forth, and philosophical ideas too, which kept filtering into the Sanskrit texts, because the guys that wrote the Sanskrit texts were in conversation with these other people all the time. So I felt that you could go back into the Sanskrit texts, because we have nothing but Sanskrit until about the 11th or 12th century, really. Then you begin to get texts in other languages. So you only have the upper class record, as it were, the record of kings, the records of the educated priests. And I felt you could go back into those texts and find out the traces, the vestiges, the suppressed but nevertheless detectable voices of women, of lower castes, and so forth. And that's what I've attempted to do in this book. One way I have done it is by paying attention to certain animals, in particular dogs, horses, and cows, all of whom are very important in Indian religious literature from the very beginning. Cows are very often symbols of Brahmins and of women, of purity, of high caste, of concerns about purity, and the argument about whether you should eat cows, for instance, which is an argument. It is not the case that Hindus don't eat cows. Some Hindus don't eat cows, and some Hindus do. And what's interesting is that they've been fighting about it for over 3,000 years. That is to say, right from the start, there were people who insisted that it was right to eat meat, and there were people who said it was not right, and that fight goes on. This is a contested religion. It's an argument. It's not a dogma. There's no Hindu pope. There's no one right thing. It's different people with different points of view, and I'm trying to bring out the ones that have been temporarily suppressed. So cows, then, are a way of focusing on this issue of our relationship with animals in general and the whole issue of vegetarianism, which became highly political at many times in India, as it is now, where it was used and is used now as a weapon against Muslims. The idea being that India is a country of Hindus, and the Muslims in India, who are a minority, according to the Hindu nationalists, should be asked to leave. And one of the arguments against them is that they eat cow, and that no one in India has ever eaten cow except Muslims, which is not true. So cows are an issue. Horses are also an issue, because horses don't do well in India. They don't thrive in India, and therefore people who want to have horses have to keep importing them, and they become very expensive. So you don't have farmers with horses the way you have in Ireland, even in the poor parts of Ireland, or in America. Only rich people could keep horses, and indeed usually foreign rulers and kings. The tax collector rode into your village on a horse. So the associations with horses are largely of dominant classes, politically dominant and economically dominant classes. What's interesting is that the villagers of India worship horses. All over India, you see little offerings of little clay horses, little wooden horses under trees and so forth, and sometimes very big terracotta horses made by people who've never had horses, who couldn't dream of supporting a horse. Use water buffalo to plow and to do the work in India, and if you have enough money, you use elephants to do the heavy work. Elephants do very well in India, thank you, but not horses. So there are ways in which these foreign, even these negative, even these oppressive foreign ideas and values are accepted and become a part of Hinduism. People write wonderful stories about wonderful horses, horses that can hear your thoughts before you express them and then save your life, just like Roy Rogers and Trigger. That whole, the horse is my dearest friend mythology, which is a Muslim mythology and a British mythology, and in general a Rajasthan Raja's mythology, is part of the folk literatures of India. The villagers who should run away every time they see a horse also tell these stories. So the horses then are a way of tracing in the texts things that are hidden otherwise, clues to an assimilation of other points of view. And then come dogs. They're having a wonderful time. I wonder what much of that is. I'm so talking about this serious stuff. Dogs are unclean in Hinduism. Hinduism, like Judaism, is a religion that cares very much about the food you eat, and also many religions, of course, care about the purity of your food and what you should eat. But to my knowledge of the large, great religions of the world, only Hinduism and Judaism have a fetish about the dishes in which food is prepared, the idea of kosher dishes, which is not the case with most other religions which don't eat, like Muslims won't eat pig, for instance. But you can still use a plate that someone else served pork on if you wash it and put something that doesn't have pig on it. But no, you can't do that with Judaism and Hinduism. So people are very careful about what they eat. That being so, you can figure out what they think of dogs, who are the scavengers of almost every society in which they are in. And therefore, dogs are the symbols of what people used to call untouchables. Now they're called Dalits. There have been thousands of names for them because it's an uncomfortable thing, so that the name doesn't really matter. The British call them the scheduled castes or the criminal castes, and there's sometimes Gandhi called them the people of God, the Harijans, and so forth. All these different words for them, but whatever you call them, they are the people at the very bottom of the heap who have been treated extremely badly throughout the history of Hinduism. People who have unclean professions. People who take care of corpses and carry them out of the house when people die. People who come and clean the latrines. People who wash the cloths that women use when they menstruate. People who do dirty jobs that involve touching parts of human waste and so forth. People who tan the hides of cows to make leather. So the people who make sandals are a very low caste and so forth. So all of those people are sometimes called dog cookers. The idea being that they eat anything. They even eat dogs who eat anything and so forth. So stories about dogs, and there are an astonishing number of stories about dogs in Hinduism, can be read as stories about the lower castes. And so there are a lot of coded stories about dogs. I'll give you an example of a famous story about a dog, which is about a lot more than dogs. It occurs in the great Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, which is this enormous Sanskrit poem, 100,000 verses, 10 times as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. Also an epic poem like that. And near the end of the entire book, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of verses in, when you're almost at the very end, the heroes, there are only 5 people left alive. Everybody has been killed in this apocalyptic battle. And the 5 heroes are left alone, And finally, all of them die, and there's only one left. And he is Yudhishthira, who is the son of the god of the moral law, Dharma. Dharma being law, righteousness, justice. And Dharma becomes incarnate as a god and fathers this human king, who's now the only person alive on earth. And as he wanders along the Himalayas, he comes to the gate of heaven. And for the last few days, he's been followed by a dog, one dog, who's been just following him. So he comes to the gates of heaven, and the gods say, Yudhishthira, welcome, come into heaven. You alone have really survived. And Yudhishthira said, fine, let me bring the dog. And they say, no, don't bring the dog. You're not allowed to have dogs in heaven. You know that. They're unclean. If the dogs even look at the offerings, they're polluted, which was true. And if an untouchable looked at a Brahmin, he had to go home and bathe and change all his clothes. Dogs are unclean. You can't bring a dog to heaven. And Yudhishthira said, this dog has been devoted to me. He uses the word bhakta, which then becomes a very important word really later in Hinduism, the word bhakti, which means the love of God who loves you. So this bhakta is my devotee, is what he's saying. And you cannot turn away someone who is devoted to you. This goes on for a long time, verses and verses and verses and verses, and Yudhishthira is steadfast. He says, I won't go to heaven then. I just don't care. I just won't go to heaven. I won't go to heaven if it means leaving this dog who is my devotee. And then the dog says, you did a really good thing, Yudhishthira, and you must come from a really good family. And he turns out that he is Dharma, Yudhishthira's father. And Dharma has tested Yudhishthira at several times during this epic, pretending to be somebody else and making him do the right answer. And Yudhishthira passed the test. And so Dharma says, you passed the test, and so Yudhishthira goes to heaven. But if you look carefully at the text, the dog doesn't go to heaven. There is no dog. And therefore, the text really does not come out and say it's okay to bring untouchables into the temple. It means a person who wants to do it is a good person. Yudhishthira has the right instinct, which is not to distinguish between an unclean animal and a clean animal. But at this point, the dog can't yet go to heaven. So this is what I mean about Hinduism being a contested religion. There are two ideas in that story, which the text has not yet really worked out. And so they do the cop-out trick, which is it didn't really happen. There really wasn't a dog. It was a dream. It was an illusion. It just appeared to be a dog. A couple of hundred years later, when the religion of bhakti, of devotion, had really taken off in India, and there were real movements abroad in India to allow the untouchables to come into the temples, which they hadn't been allowed into before. And there was a big fight about it. There are still temples that untouchables can't go into to this day. Just a few years ago, a man was killed for trying to go into a temple. He wasn't allowed to. So there's been progress. It's like racism in America. We're working on it, and we're making some progress, but we're not there yet. So there was progress made from this point in around 200 BCE. Around 1,000 years later, another story was told. And the story was told, and this was a time in India when there were great shrines that people would make pilgrimages to. And the story was told of a very wicked king who had committed a number of sins, and as he was dying, he wanted to purify himself and make a pilgrimage to the finest, most powerful shrine in India in order to have absolution. And a shrine in India is usually, and this one was, a place where you bathe. It's often on a river, and if not, at least it has a tanka, a lake or a pond. But this was on a river, a famous shrine on a river. So the man came to the river, and as he approached the river, the voice of the shrine cried out and said, "You cannot bathe here. You are so polluted that you would pollute the shrine. Right? You're too sick to take the medicine." So he couldn't reach what would purify him because he would pollute it. So he didn't know what to do. And at that moment, a dog jumped into the river, swam around a little bit, came out and did what dogs do, which is he shook. And he shook himself, and the drops of water from the shrine touched this king named Vena, and at the same time he was frightened of the dog. The dog ran toward him as he shook himself, and in order to get away from the dog, he jumped into the shrine. He jumped into the pond. And he was absolved of his sins, and he was taken to heaven because the dog was able to move, to mediate really, between him and the shrine, both to purify him just enough. You know how when you make a souffle, you make the roux and then you put some of the egg whites in, and then you put some of the roux back into the egg whites, and so that it was just enough of the water of the shrine to make him able to really use the shrine. And his fear of the dog made him forget the injunction, which was no longer valid. So this is a very different. This is a real dog who was able to go into the shrine, who did not pollute the shrine, and who was able to bring the man to heaven. So you can see that over the centuries, people were thinking about this. People were trying to work out ways to make it better, and they did it in the form of stories about dogs in these Brahmin-authored texts, which were basically very caste-oriented. But this is a story in which the author is able to express a more liberal, quasi-revolutionary attitude without actually saying, you know, I really think we should allow untouchables into the shrines of India. Let me give you another example of progress, another story. I have lots and lots of stories. Also from the Mahabharata, and I'll tell you the story, and then I'll also tell you what became of the story. So the same text, that 200 BC perhaps, it goes like this. The 5 heroes of the Mahabharata, remember the last one was this King Yudhishthira, all 5 of them were taught archery by a great teacher named Drona, who was the greatest master of martial arts in India. And one of the brothers in particular, named Arjuna, was the best archer in the world. And one day, a boy named Ekalavya came to see them, and he was the son of a tribal. Now, the tribal people are like the untouchables beyond the Hindu pale. They're not caste Hindus. They're considered unclean, they hunt animals, and they don't obey the rules of Hinduism normally, so they're very low caste indeed. So he said to Drona, the teacher, would you please accept me as a pupil? And Drona said, you're out of your mind? You're not of royal blood. I'm teaching the princes, the king's sons. Go away. So Ekalavya went off, and he made a statue of Drona, of the teacher of the princes. And he paid the statue the respect due to a teacher. He bowed to it every day. There's a whole lot of stuff he's supposed to do for a teacher. He did all of that, and he taught himself archery. And he became a great archer. One day, the 5 brothers went hunting with their dog. These dogs are very useful in these stories. The dog wandered off and got lost, and he came upon Ekalavya, who was, the text tells us, black, wrapped in black deerskin, hair all matted, dressed in rags, his body caked with dirt. So he's physically filthy. He's also dark-skinned, which is a sign of low caste by this time. And the dog barked at him, right? Dogs are classists. Dogs bark at homeless people. Dogs know when people are not the same as the bourgeois. Bourgeois dogs bark at homeless people, I'm here to tell you. And so this dog barked at Ekalavya. And Ekalavya shot 7 arrows simultaneously into the dog's mouth, shooting the mouth shut. The dog, with his mouth full of arrows, went whimpering back to the 5 princes, who expressed their admiration for the man who had accomplished this amazing feat of archery and went to find him. Nothing about the poor dog, right? No, just, God, 7 arrows like that? Wow. They found him and asked who he was, and he told them that he was the Nishada, the tribal boy named Ekalavya, a pupil of Drona's, he said. Only then did they recognize him. They went home, but Arjuna, that's the prince who's the great archer, kept thinking about Ekalavya, and one day he asked Drona why he had a pupil, the son of a Nishada, who was an even better archer than Arjuna was. Drona then resolved to do something about this. He took Arjuna with him to see Ekalavya, and when he found him, he said to Ekalavya, "If you are my pupil, pay me my fee right now." Now, tuition in ancient India is paid after. It's sort of a graduation fee, which I think also is paid at the University of Chicago. The students have to pay something in the quarter in which they graduate. It's called a Guru Dakshina, a gift to the Guru. And over the years, my South Asian students usually bring me a present. It's usually a book or something as a token to the teacher. That's what you do. So he said, okay, if you're my pupil, pay me. Ekalavya, delighted, said, command me, my Guru. There is nothing I will not give my Guru. Drona replied, give me your right thumb. When Ekalavya heard this terrible speech, the text says, this terrible speech from Drona, he kept his promise. His face showed his joy in it, and his mind was entirely resolved to do it. He cut off his thumb and gave it to Drona. And after that, when the Nishada shot an arrow, his fingers were not so quick as before. Arjuna was greatly relieved. So that's the story in the Mahabharata, and it's a brutal story, even for the Mahabharata, which is about a very brutal war. So what can we make of this story? Who is Ekalavya? He's a prince among the tribals, but that counts for nothing. He's a very low caste person. And so in order to protect the rules of caste and the reputation of his own world-class archery student, the teacher Drona claims his tuition, the Guru Dakshina. Of course, we are shocked, but where is the sympathy of the author of this text? It's hard to be sure, I think. On the one hand, the text feels it's uppity of Ekalavya to push in where he does not belong. He cannot be an archer, for he was born into the wrong family for archery. The text believes this. The text is still 200 BC. That's the way the caste system works. But Ekalavya does not act uppity. His outward appearance invokes all the conventional tropes for outcast tribals. He's made of the wrong stuff. We would say he has the wrong genes. He is literally dirt. But his inner soul, reflected in his behavior, is pious and respectful. He does what his teacher tells him to do. Not only is he a brilliant archer, but he is honest and humble. To this extent, at least, the text likes him and I think pities him. It refers to Drona's command as terrible. So the text is already divided on this issue. It takes the basic party line, but when you read what it says about it, it's not the party line, he was a terrible person and he got what was coming to him. That's not the spirit of the text at all. The act by which Ekalavya proves his mettle as an archer is one of gratuitous and grotesque cruelty to a dog, the animal that is in many ways the animal counterpart, even the totem of a nishada, of a tribal. The dog barks at him, doesn't like the way he looks, and probably smells. Does Ekalavya's unsympathetic treatment of this dog cancel out our sympathy for Ekalavya as the victim of interhuman violence? Does it justify Drona's cruel treatment of him? What goes around comes around? Or does it at least remind us of the cruelty inherent in the caste-specific dharma of a hunter? He does cruel things are done to him. The text shows no sympathy for the dog and therefore no condemnation for Ekalavya. So I think that's how we feel. I don't think that's how the text feels. The text doesn't say, oh, what a terrible thing he did to the dog. It says, what a brilliant archer. I read the text as deeply conflicted. It assumes that this is the way things must be, but it doesn't like the way things must be. It paints Ekalavya sympathetically despite itself. The author of this story, despite his defense of the caste system, saw the humanity in Ekalavya, saw that outcasts were human beings of dignity and honor. It doesn't necessarily mean that tribal people tried to break into the professions of the class of nobles and warriors. I don't think you can read this text as a description of what people did. It's an imagined incident. I doubt that it ever happened. Nor does it mean that nobles went around cutting off the thumbs of tribal people. I don't think that happened either. It means that the author of this text imagined the situation and was troubled by it. The people who heard and eventually read the text must have seen that too. Maybe some of them, as a result, treated the tribals whom they encountered with more humanity. The imagination of a better world may have made it a better world. Moreover, during the long history of this story, different people did read the stories differently. The reading of the Brahmin imaginary, this is the caste system and has to be, was certainly not the only one. So I'd like to show you a couple more readings and then I'll stop, just to show you how the text grows up. Whatever the spirit in which the tale of Ekalavya was originally told, it continued to be remembered among people crying out for social reform. A glance at later versions of the same story supports some of the hypothetical meanings that I've hunted out of the original tellings and suggests, but certainly does not prove, that the seed of that later response may have already been there in the Sanskrit text, or at least that there may have been other readings of this episode besides the original one we have, with other evidence of moral conscience to bridge the gap between the first recorded telling, which is the one I read you, and the later version that explicitly calls out for justice. There's a Jaina text from the 16th century that begins much like the Mahabharata story of Ekalavya, but then goes in a different direction. Arjuna learned the science of archery from Drona and honored him with many gems, and the Guru said to him, "Choose a boon." And Arjuna said, "If you're satisfied with me, let there be no one but me who knows such a science of archery." So you begin with Arjuna choosing his boon. And Drona agreed. One day, a tribal came and asked Drona to be his guru. Same thing happened, denied. He made an image of Drona and practiced the science of Drona and so forth and became a great archer. And one day, Arjuna saw that the mouth of his own dog was filled with arrows that had not pierced his upper lip, lower lip, palate, tongue, or teeth. So now, 16th century, someone cares about the dog. Someone cares about the dog and cares that Ekalavya shouldn't have hurt the dog. So we see people thinking the way we thought, in a way, and doing something about it. Thinking, no one but me has such a power, Arjuna was amazed. And going forth by following the arrows from his dog's mouth, he saw the tribal and said, "Who shot those arrows into the dog's mouth?" "I did." "Who is your guru?" "Drona is my guru." Hearing that, Arjuna reported this to Drona, then said, "Hey, master, why does this happen?" Drona went there and said to the tribal, "Where is your guru?" And the tribal showed him the representation that he himself had made and told him what he had done. But the sneaky, cheating Arjuna, says this text, said to the tribal boy, "With your great zeal, you must do puja with the thumb of your right hand for this Drona, whom you met through us." So now it's not Drona, but Arjuna that asks him to cut his thumb off. The tribal boy said yes and did it. But then Drona, the guru, said, "Arjuna, you are a sneaky, cheating city slicker, and you have deceived this artless, honest, unsophisticated forest dweller. But by my favor, even without a thumb, these people will be able to shoot arrows." And as he said this, the guru gave the tribal this favor and went back to his own place. And so even today, a tribal can shoot arrows using his middle finger and his forefinger. So there's a real improvement there. There's a real improvement there. You can see that people have been bothered by it. The moral weight has shifted. Now it's Arjuna, the prince, not the teacher, who makes the cruel demand, and the teacher who objects to it and who calls Arjuna deceitful and cunning, in contrast with the honest, artless tribal who does not hurt the dog. So the image of Drona is now also made into the image of the guru that transforms the tribal into a person who has a right to be an archer, even without his finger. And the forefinger is called the Tarjaniya, the pointing finger, and it points at Arjuna. Yes?
Why did this change occur? The only thing I can think of is, for example, Islam, which, for all its faults, is a very egalitarian religion. And I know it had been driving into India at that time. Do you think that could have been a factor in that?
I certainly do. Not just Islam, but Buddhism.
But Buddhism was older, right?
Buddhism from the start was arguing with Hinduism and producing movements in Hinduism which were compassionate and pro-animal and anti-caste. So
it started in 500 BC.
it started and it built more and more, and Islam was indeed a major contribution to it, especially the branch of Islam which was combined with Hinduism and was called Sufism. Sufism in particular was antinomian, anti-caste, thumbing its nose at the Brahmins and so forth. So it wasn't just Islam. It wasn't sort of a sudden movement. These people came in and took over India and said, hey, God, you got to get rid of the caste system. Within Hinduism itself, there were kind of really in the Mahabharata even, there were lots of stories being told questioning the justice of the strict caste system. And in addition, there was Buddhism. In addition, there was the rise of a merchant class that wasn't going to take any bullshit from Brahmins, and who started writing their own texts, which were different from the Brahmin texts. And Islam, indeed, was also one. So the whole mood had changed by this time. Yeah.
I asked in Islam, a Bangladeshi friend of mine, Islam, when the invasion occurred, bring about conversion by the sword? And he said, absolutely not. The lower castes, the Dalits, found salvation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There were some guys who did, in fact, convert by the sword, very few. And then a big fuss has been made about that by these same Hindus that I'm always arguing with. And there, alas, there is some grounds for them to say that. But by and large, the enormous conversions were not because of that. They were conversions by people who really liked it, who went to it. And indeed, even without conversion, Hinduism picked up a great deal of ideas from Islam, which were incorporated into Hindu, so you didn't even have to convert in some ways. You know, just by walking around in India, that the architecture was totally transformed by the Persian style. And that's a hint, that should be a clue to you, that other forms of culture, including religion, were also transformed. And there were Sufi pirs who were worshipped by Hindus. There were forms of Hindu romances that were translated into Islam and changed Islam. There was an enormous cultural fusion, particularly later on. You know, the Delhi Sultanate began in the 10th century, and the Mughals were the ones who did the great work of fusion. But it was happening all along. And even before Islam conquered India, that is to say, even before the Delhi Sultans in the 11th century, practically within months of the death of the Prophet, there were Muslims in India just as individual merchants. No, not the great big armies coming in from the north and taking over, but there were people who built mosques on the west shore of India, down below Gujarat, and in South India. There have been Muslims in India from the 8th, 9th century. So there's just been a Muslim presence in India for a long time. There's also a Christian presence in India for a long time. Okay, lots of questions. You had your hand up, and then the man in the back.
Thank you. Flash forward a little bit. I heard on the news today that the population of India is expected to exceed that of China within a few short years, making it a dominant nation in terms of population with a great influence commercially, politically, and ideologically. And I'm wondering, with your interpretation of the change in Hinduism, how this tectonic plate shift in our demographics in favor of India could possibly affect world geopolitics, and what kind of preparation we need to make to cope with an emerging dominant Hindu population in a strategic part of the world.
Wow. There've always been a lot of there've always been a lot of Hindus. I mean, this has been a big country for a long time. By and large, they have been a very tolerant and diverse religion, far less inclined to fundamentalism than the monotheisms, in part because they aren't a monotheism, and monotheism, I think, tends to make people a little monolithic. But this particular strain of Hinduism is monotheistic. and denies that Hinduism is polytheistic at all. They say we worship one God. Well, we call him Shiva or Vishnu or the case be, but we really only worship one God, which is the denial of the spirit of Hinduism, which does indeed have a monistic strain, has always had that basically the whole of the universe is a single substance of which our souls are a part, but nevertheless they worship individual gods for different things, tell stories about them, have different temples to them, and all the trappings of polytheism. So what has kept Hinduism honest, as it were, over the centuries and has made it a more tolerant religion than Christianity or Islam is also in question now as the politically dominant, although I repeat, by no means numerically dominant. I mean, most people in India are still Hindus of the more open-minded, you worship one kind of a god, I worship another kind of a god sort of people. But this internet crowd tends to be monistic and to also insist that Hinduism has always been monotheistic, and so they're just picking up all our worst habits and giving up some of their myth.
Any political party?
Well, the BJP, of course. It's BJP. And the BJP, as you know, was in power in Delhi for a while and is no longer in power in Delhi, but is extremely powerful in other parts of India and has could take power at any time. Its program, well, it's complicated. We probably can't get into it, but it's powerful not merely or not even primarily because the people of India like this kind of fundamentalist bullshit, but because it has a very sound and important economic policy, which is very attractive to a lot of people. It comes with this unfortunate theological overtone, but it's not really why they're so successful. They've done a great deal for farmers. No one is, there may even be something that Bush does right. I can't offhand think of it, but no one is entirely wrong. So the BJP has a lot of reasons for being dominant. One, that they appeal to a kind of Hindu nationalism, and another, that they apparently have a better thought out economic policy than the Congress Party at the moment. So it's hard to see where it's going to go, but they're very important in India. They control a great deal of the policy. They're the people who censor the films, who expelled Hassan when he made a statue of a goddess, who have not allowed Mehta to produce her films Fire and Earth and Water in India and so forth. So the repressive puritanical spirit comes from the BJP, and they exert their influence beyond the considerable area where they actually are politically in charge to India as a whole. They control a lot of the media, a lot of television and so forth. So, yes, the man in the back and then the man. Well, okay.
First comment, it's much more powerful to pull a bow with your two fingers like this than with your thumb.
It's a good way to do it anyway, you're saying. So who needs a thumb?
For example, and the French didn't like marching, they cut their fingers off. So the English would give the victory sign, but they still had their fingers, they were still shooting the bow.
So you don't really need your thumb at all?
You don't, no, it's a very weak hold. I mean, look at
But you press down on it, don't
That's
you?
right, but with the two fingers, you don't press down on it. You wrap it around the bowstring, you pull it back, and you just let it go. Your hand naturally wants to open, and you can really pull a much stronger bow.
Well, that's what the God finally gives as a boon to these guys, to shoot exactly the way you're saying.
That's good. The other thing was, isn't there a certain advantage of Muslims or any of the monotheistic religions that you know what God to pray to? And with all these Indian gods, what happens if you mix a god? If you just pray your God, you're supposed to pray to another God. Normally we pray, the answer is no, but even so, you've got the right person.
The way that it's really thought of, most Hindus in India have always had their own favorite god. I mean, when you look at the Hebrew Bible, after all, the authors of the Hebrew Bible did not believe that Yahweh was the only God. They believed that Baal was also a god. They simply thought that he wasn't a very interesting or important god and that their God was more powerful. So people who we think of as monotheists, such as the ancient Hebrews, were still willing to admit the existence of other gods, but simply denied their efficacy or their equal efficacy. That's kind of what Hinduism is like. You worship Vishnu, and there are a lot of reasons for worshiping Vishnu. Perhaps because your parents worship Vishnu. Perhaps because you're married to a man who worshipped Vishnu. Perhaps because you had a dream one night and Vishnu told you to come to him. There are all sorts of reasons why you might choose to worship a particular god. But when your neighbor goes to the Shiva temple, you don't think he's out of his mind. He's doing for Shiva what you are doing for Vishnu. Moreover, on certain days of the month, you'll worship Ganesha because that's Ganesha's day. And at the festival of the goddess Kali, you'll worship the goddess Kali because that's her day. When you travel with friends and you go to a famous temple, which has a shrine to Durga, you'll worship Durga because that place is where she is. So there's a kind of open-minded attitude toward different people having different faiths, even though you will have a God to whom you normally pray, and there are all sorts of reasons for it. It's a very tolerant religion that way, theologically.
Is it a barter religion where you burn a lamb, like I think in Roman Catholicism, and you bring an offering, burn offering in return for answer?
Absolutely. You give things to the gods, they give things back to you. And in particular, you give food to them, you give offerings of usually vegetarian food and flowers, and at the end of the service, the god's leftovers, which usually seem to be just about as much as the stuff you offered him, are distributed by the priest to the people there. So actually, even what you give to the god, literally, the apple, the orange that you offered to him may come back to you with the addition of the god's blessing on it. So it's a very straightforward religion that way. Anne Grogins Gold, educated here, great anthropologist, did a wonderful book called Fruitful Journeys, in which she went with a bunch of women from Rajasthan, from the village in Rajasthan where she worked. She went with them on a pilgrimage across India to some shrine in Bhubaneswar, Orissa. And she found out why these women were going on pilgrimage. A lot of them were going on pilgrimage in order to just get out of housework for a couple of weeks. Some of them were going on pilgrimage to get away from their husbands. Some of them were going on pilgrims to be with their women friends and just sort of have some time to themselves.
Sex in the City.
Huh?
Like Sex in the City.
Yeah, just go on. Some of them were going because they had a problem they wanted to solve, and they wanted to make a real religious effort to solve it. Maybe someone was real sick in the family and they wanted them to get well again. Some of them wanted to make sure their kids were accepted at the University of Chicago. Some of them were praying for the salvation of their souls and rebirth in the world of moksha, but very, very few. So this earthy religion of India is really the dominant strain, and you would have people, no matter what god you worship, you'd come together to go to that shrine because that was a famous shrine that anyone could worship at, and on that day, that would be the god you would pray to. Yes? Okay, then him
Has
first.
anyone made a comparison with the polytheism of the ancient Greeks?
Oh, yes.
And how does it compare?
It compares in a number of interesting ways. There's a wonderful book by Paul Vane called Did the Greeks Believe in Their Myths? And the answer basically is no. That is to say, the kind of deep piety that you find in Hinduism is not characteristic of the Greek texts that we have. They were rationalists even when they were worshippers, and there are moments in some of Aeschylus's poems to Zeus where you have something like a real awe of a divinity, but very little. Zeus is mainly just a bad joke and so forth. So I think the spirit, there are exceptions, but of course that would be something like the Eleusinian mysteries, which, because they are mysteries, we don't know much about. But the religion that we really know a lot about, Dodds wrote a wonderful book, E.R. Dodds, The Greeks and the Irrational, in which he outlined more than anybody else the deep levels of belief that actually can be found, not so much in Greek literature, but in the archaeology and some of the vase paintings and so forth, which gives a suggestion of a kind of serious religiosity which is hard to find in the literature itself. But in the literature, no. The Hindu polytheism is much more passionate. Now the guy in the back with the quick blue shirt.
Two things. Firstly, to give a short answer to this woman's question here, I don't think that her comment of India versus China will have that kind of result, certainly not in the near future, simply because India does not have the focused, state-supported economic machine which has emerged in China and is motivating that extremely. When I was in Shanghai a few years ago, everybody was joking that China's national bird was the crane, not the Manchurian crane, the construction crane.
That's very nice. That's very nice.
The question I wanted to pose to you, Professor Doniger, is a friend of mine, Raj Sachdeva, had made an observation, and I'm wondering if you would concur with it, that the arrival of the Jewish colonies, especially in southeastern India, like Goa,
Southwestern India.
southwestern, yes, my apologies, southwestern India, like Goa, also held an attraction for the Dalit because there was no rank exclusion in Jewish worship.
That may well be, but the fact is that the Jewish colony did not thrive. It did not grow. It practically died out. There's very little of it left at all, really. So whatever appeal it had was, I think, dwarfed by the appeal in that same part of the world, namely Southwest India, by first St. Thomas, who was said to have come to India, been sent by Jesus himself, in fact, sold into slavery by Jesus himself. He said, send me anywhere, but don't send me to India. Jesus said, you're going to India. And so there's a whole colony from him. And then the Protestant missionaries as well. So that Kerala in particular has got lots and lots of Christians in it. That's the same part. And the Cochin is the one place that has a real history of synagogues and so forth, but it's very small. Never really did catch on in that same way compared to Christianity, and Christianity didn't catch on compared to Islam, and Islam never caught on compared to Hinduism. Hinduism still enormously dominates the religious scene.
Although the Jews do not per se believe in missionary process.
That's right. That's right. That's one reason why they didn't thrive. They didn't convert. Yeah. Yes.
A comment and a question. What your description of the pilgrimage experience and especially motives sounds very reminiscent of medieval pilgrimage stories in Europe.
Well, Chaucer. Think of Chaucer. Everybody's having a great time.
All kinds of others. I mean, stories around Santiago de Compostela are the same kind of thing. So I kind of wonder if it's maybe just the lure of travel, but that's a speculation.
Yeah.
My question has to do with Hinduism in this country, since we are getting more and more immigrants of the Hindu persuasion. What's happening with Hinduism in this country? Are we taking in Hindu perhaps concepts, constructs, whatever, into other religions in this country?
Question.
And what's happening to Hinduism itself in this country?
Yeah, that was a very good question. Very good question. I, as you know, almost didn't make this lecture because I was flying home yesterday from San Francisco, where there was weather in San Francisco and there was weather in Chicago, and I almost didn't get in. And I was in San Francisco because I spent a week down at Big Sur at Esalen. And there was just a lot of talk about karma and a lot of talk about, all that sort of thing. So the short answer to your question, and it's a long answer, it's a whole chapter in my book, is that Hinduism has been a serious thread of American religiosity because of Chicago, beginning in 1893. The World Parliament of Religion in 1893 brought Vivekananda, a great Indian sage of this British-influenced, rather puritanical brand of Hinduism, very philosophical, not at all sex and polytheism. And ever since then, there have been Blavatsky and the Philosophia Perennis, and there have been all sorts of Vedanta societies. So there has actually been a movement among Americans, most famously the hippies of the 60s, but really starting in the late 19th century with Emerson's love of the Bhagavad Gita and so forth, there has been some Hindu influence on American thinking at different times, and right at the moment, it's having a real efflorescence. It's the yoga, the spread of yoga in America is simply extraordinary, and all of that brings with it Hindu ideas. There have also been Hindu people coming to America, not just simply proselytizing, and a great wave of them came in the 60s. And so there have been many more Hindus in America, and another wave came more recently. And so there are lots of Hindus, especially in certain places. Emory has an enormous South Asian community. Toronto has a big South Asian community. There's a big Hindu temple in Lamont on the outskirts of Chicago and so forth. So there are Hindus in America. What's happened in the last 10 years is partly because of the BJP, partly because of the internet. There has been a very militant movement among Hindus in America to take charge of Hinduism in America. There has been a movement, for instance, starting in California, but also in Fairfield County, Virginia, to revise the high school textbooks on world religions to remove any reference to the caste system and to remove any reference to the mistreatment of women or the burning of women for their dowries and so forth. They want those sections to be written by Hindus, and by Hindus they mean their kind of Hindus. They want those texts to say that Hindu is monotheistic and so forth and so on. So there's a move with these very vociferous people who, funny, we were talking about it at Esalen, and there's a man who knows a lot about it. He said, you know, most of these people are computer scientists of various kinds and engineers. And people like that, if you make one little mistake, the whole program falls apart. If you make a mistake in designing a bridge, the bridge falls down. And so they don't share the kind of, well, you believe this, I believe that, kind of mellowness, which is characteristic, on the one hand, of Hinduism in general, and on the other hand, of a great deal of the scholarship of Hinduism, which says, you know, we really don't know about this. Our best guess is this. We don't know what this word means. Perhaps it means that. And they are looking for a kind of precision in the humanities, which is inappropriate. So they're very, very critical, and they don't know Sanskrit, so they don't really know how to translate the Sanskrit words, but they think it's our religion, we should take it over. So there's a real nationalist thrust in America for these Hindus on the internet. They have their blogs, they have the conversations. Wikipedia is simply unreadable for anyone who knows anything about India. It's just dominated by just wrong information about Hinduism, and they're very concerned that they should control the information. So these textbooks in America are really quite significant. And so far, a bunch of scholars led by Witzel at Harvard and people, there's a whole organization of scholars who have resisted the corrections to the textbooks. But it keeps popping up again, and there are PTA organizations and protests and demands that non-Hindu professors of Indian religions be fired and Hindus be hired in their place, and so forth and so on. So there's just a lot of fuss. Yes.
Continue that question. How is America affecting Hinduism? How are we affecting it?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think we're affecting Hinduism in India very much. I mean, the British did because they were running the damn place. When we just sort of sit here and write our books, and some people read them.
Come here. Are we influencing in that way?
Hindu immigrants who come here change. Immigrants who come here change. Sometimes they don't marry Hindus anymore. I mean, you know, the older generation hangs on, and they lose that battle ultimately. So yes, Hinduism does in fact change when it comes here. In particular, it changes because only you have to have a certain amount of money. You have to be, to get here at all, you have to be a particular kind of a person. So Hinduism is narrowed to that sort of Hinduism. There aren't that many people of low caste that come here, for instance. Half the people you meet will be Brahmins, and the other half will be well-born Vaishyas, merchants, and so forth. So it's already an edited Hinduism when it gets here, and then it looks around and it becomes Americanized, and people whose parents are vegetarians start eating meat, and people whose parents wear saris start wearing trousers and so forth. So that happens. Yes.
I just wanted to comment on that, and it actually links into something you were asking about the Jewish influence in India, because I've been reading a little bit about how Hindus as a political movement are modeling themselves on like the American Jewish Committee and on the Jewish, what's referred to as Israel lobbyists and lobbies. So there's actually,
that's
there's
interesting.
actually this Hindu-Jewish link. And another thing I wanted to check out with you is, you were talking about Shiva people not being insulted by Vishnu people. And actually my understanding is that I think especially in the lower caste level maybe, that everyone's going to everything. Like, they'll go to a Christian shrine, they'll go to a Muslim shrine because it's
Not just lower caste, everybody. Yep.
And you have like long lines in a particular day that's, you know, and I
It's
just
always-
find that fascinating. Because
Absolutely.
I mean, there's just this feeling that I was exposed to when I was there. I was so different, which is this tuning into spirituality. And I remember once I was with a bunch of economists, okay? And they were all
Spirituality is
talking-
not their long suit.
And they were talking about what spiritual places feel like. I mean, imagine if you would have that conversation at the UC. So I just thought, wow, I'm in a different place.
Yeah.
But this is a spiritual place.
Well, it's an everything place.
I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying when I'm around a lot of economists here, I would be surprised if that conversation came up.
That's a mistake, probably.
Choose a different batch of people than
Yeah.
me.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. Why are you hanging out with economists?
I'm actually not hanging out with economists. That's why I am hanging out with economists that didn't go that way. So it's kind of a strange question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm an alumni advisor for the UChicago, and we have four very Americanized young men from India that are in it. One of them lost their president of the Indian Students Association, and about 300, I understand, one has been born in India, came over 3.5 years old, the other is second generation, all four have highly educated parents and so forth. So I have a technical question. I'm used to seeing Indian ladies with a little red, looks almost very lip.
The bindu.
Lip with a little.
Yep, the drop.
I guess it's a brown symbol.
No, it's just cosmetics, like mascara. It looks nice. The red in the part of the hair is a symbol of that you're married. Married women mark the part in the hair with red, but people often wrongly think this means that you're married. It's just kind of a nice thing to do. It's like a thing on your nose.
All of them, three of them are very, very brilliant students, but one of them had done a lot of speech and everything in high school and so forth, and state and so forth. He has something I haven't seen before. He has a slash almost like lipstick. Is that long down the center of his forehead? What would that?
That's a Shiva mark, and that's a Vaishnava mark. It marks that you're a worshiper of Shiva. It's the Trishul. It's the trident. Shiva carries a three-pronged stick, and the mark of the trident is usually a triple mark, but sometimes it's abbreviated to one. So it's
one down the middle.
yeah. It means that he's a worshiper of the god Shiva. That does have significance.
Brahman, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
That's a subcategory of Brahmanism.
Well, it's a different category. I mean, on the one hand, the question is, what is your class? You can be a Brahmin class. There are 4 classes: Brahmin class, warrior class, merchant class, and servants. And then the untouchables are out of the class system. Then there are hundreds and thousands of castes. So you're a Brahmin, but you could be this kind of a Brahmin or that kind of a Brahmin. You could be this kind of a merchant or that kind of a merchant. Related usually, but not always, to professions. And then there's the question of who you worship, which has nothing to do with either your class or your caste. So there's lots of different ways of identifying yourself.
Because I know he's a Brahmin, so that's a supplementary.
Most people in India identify one another and themselves by their caste. So you wouldn't say he's a Shaiva the way you might say this person is a Christian or a Muslim. You'd say he's a potter, or he's a weaver, or he's a policeman. In other words, you'd identify someone by their caste, one of these hundreds and thousands of castes, rather than by either his class or by his worship. You wouldn't say he's a worshiper of Shiva, unless you were saying, what temple shall we go to? And you'll say, well, let's go with him. He worships at the Shiva temple. Only in the context of worship would it be identified in that way. And indeed, that's the way you would also, it's only on that occasion that you would say he's a Muslim. You would say he's an economics student. He's studying painting in Delhi. And then only if you're saying, what shall we go to this temple? You'd say, well, go with him. He doesn't worship at a temple. He worships at a mosque. And even then, he'd probably go with you to the temple. Yeah.
Ever so often, we started going to Indian restaurants and noticing that there was beef tandoor on the menu.
Mm-hmm.
Smoking gun that is owned and operated by Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of mixing going in.
Mm.
Do you predict or sense any political implications of the growing Muslim influence in India? Will that add strength to the fundamentalists in the Middle East, or will that kind of dampen the fundamentalist fervor as those Hindus, those Muslims get mixed in with a more secular, liberal crowd of Hindus?
I'm hoping that the second will be the case, that these noisy people are not going to win the day, that the general assimilationist thrust of life in India, which began with the Industrial Revolution and the British, because when you work in a factory, you really can't take care of caste the same way that you can when you work in a village. But caste simply held out in some places. But the information industries in Bangalore, those people that answer the phone in the middle of the night when you want to check your visa bill, those people are living a life in which it's simply impossible to maintain communal boundaries. And so there has been a real, on the day-to-day level, there's been a real progress in assimilation and intermarriage and just interaction, even while the guys carrying the banners in the streets are getting nastier and nastier. So two different kinds of movements in different levels of the population.
So it might dilute some of the fundamentalist fervor of Islam
I'm
and
hoping.
make them more assimilated into the worldwide population.
I'm hoping that more and more people won't buy it. Just will say, I don't feel that way about Muslims. I don't think all the Muslims should leave India. I just don't buy it. That's what I'm hoping. Yeah.
That's been a problem also in Indonesia, where the Hindu community in Bali, until recent interventions, largely quietly but out by the U.S., have forced the government to dampen it. The Hindus have had the benefit of it, but it was really a fundamentalist American thing to protect the Christians on further out islands. But the Hindu community
It benefited from it too. Christians are doing very badly in India right now. There have been a lot of murders of priests and nuns, and violence and tearing down of Christian churches and so forth. So it's not just the Muslims that are suffering from the Hindu fundamentalists. The Christians are also suffering. In the back.
I have a question. You mentioned the criminal caste,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand the thugs were done in by the British. We didn't have thugs.
Mm-hmm.
How about the dacoits? Are those a particular caste, or are they just...
Dacoits aren't a caste. Dacoits really the word for highway robbers. And there's always guys that are going to hold you up. There's no particular caste. No, thuggies and dacoits are not a caste. The dacoits it's just a word for guys who rob you. And the thuggies were a religious sect, which is not the same as a caste. They were a group of people who worshipped Kali. They could have come from various castes, but they grouped together in the worship of the Kali and the dedication of the invocation of Kali in order to get the British to leave India. So that they were also, they engineered a number of attacks on British garrisons in the name of the goddess Kali. They weren't very powerful. I think you can get a good look at them in the movie Gunga Din, which is with Gary Cooper, with Sam Jaffe unconvincingly playing the low-caste water carrier Gunga Din. And you can also see Gunga Din in Peter Sellers' movie The Party, which begins with Peter Sellers playing the part of Gunga Din. And you can also see it in the Beatles' Help, when they fall through a manhole cover and end up in medieval India where people are saying, Kali, Kali, and Liam McCurran is the priest of the temple. So the Kali imagery is more Hollywood than history. They weren't a very important sect, but the British conflated their religious goals and their political goals and felt that they were using the goddess to kill the British, but they weren't. They were just killing the British the way any right-thinking Hindus did at that point, and they happened to be worshippers of Kali. So there's a kind of a misconception of the Thuggis. There's a famous book by Sleeman, Randalls and Recollections of a British something or other by Colonel Sleeman, and that's where all the mythology comes from. He wrote it in about 1810. It's full of tall tales about the Thuggis, and everyone loved them. Yeah.
I know you like Peter Brooks' Mahabharata. I was wondering, what do you think are the shortcomings of that?
The Peter Brooks Mahabharata. Peter Brook made a stage production of the Mahabharata in Paris, and then it was translated in English and it toured here. I saw it at the Brooklyn Academy of Music a long time ago, 25 years ago. And that has been filmed. It's about a 5.5-hour film, and it's a DVD. And I always show it to my Mahabharata class. It's an extremely good way to get an idea of what the Mahabharata is all about. Its shortcomings are not, I think, all that serious. The casting is ideological. It's cast by people who are not Indians. That is to say, the parts are played by 1 or 2 Indian actors. And Mani Sarabhai, the great daughter of the great industrialist, is there. And 1 or 2 Indian actors, but there are Japanese actors, African actors, Indonesian actors, and so forth. And I think that's counterproductive because it makes it's saying this is not just an Indian story, it's a story for all the world. Well, yes, of course. Any great story is a story for all the world, but it is an Indian story, and it's really disturbing in some ways to see the characters speak with Japanese accents and so forth. I think it's been argued, I think a little unfairly, that the casting is racist, that all the demonic and violent characters are played by African actors. They are, but African actors also play a lot of other characters that are not demonic, so I think Bhishma is played by an African, and he is the great grandfather of them all. So I find the casting a little bit annoying, but not racist. And as far as I know, that's really the only thing about it. It's selective. It doesn't select all the things I would have selected, but it selects most of the things. It's a given that you have to cut a great deal out if you're going to reduce 100,000 verses to 5 hours. I think it's a pretty good selection. My old friend Barbara Stoller Miller was the consultant for the translation, and it's basically accurate, and it's moving and it's charming. I really like it very much. I see it every year with my students, and they always love it. And I always find something new in it that I hadn't noticed before. So I recommend it to you if you're interested in Mahabharata. So we're over time. We have to stop. Okay, thank you.